Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. My name is Andrew Shepherd, and I am a lecturer in Theology and Public Issues in the Theology Programme at the University of Otago. This presentation, The Throwaway Society, Reflecting on Rubbish, was originally given as a webinar as part of the Faith and Thinking series put on by the Theology Programme in April of 2020. With the exception of a vocal minority, there now appears almost universal acceptance that at the beginning of the 21st century, the Earth is facing major ecological challenges. Indeed, the understanding that human activity is now the fundamental factor impacting the biophysical systems of the Earth has led many to suggest that actually we are entering into a new geological epoch. We are no longer in the Holocene, but rather have entered the Anthropocene epoch. Indeed, from the highest mountains to the depths of the ocean, nowhere on Earth now appears unsullied by human activity. In May 2015, an expedition was sent to South Col, just beneath the summit of Mount Everest, to clear away the human detritus, waste and rubbish that had been left by previous mountaineering expeditions. 4 years later, in May 2019, American deep-sea explorer Victor Vescova descended nearly 11 kilometers into the deepest place in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean's Mariana Trench. There, he discovered new sea creatures unknown to science, and a plastic bag and sweet wrappers. Of course, rubbish is not merely found in the Mariana Trench and on the top of the Himalayas, but surrounds us in our day-to-day living. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Kiwis produce 3.6 kilograms of waste per person every day. And our levels of rubbish production are going up. There's a 20% increase today as there was from 3 years ago. And our daily waste production is 5 times the global daily average of 0.65 kilograms. Unsurprisingly, while rubbish is a global phenomenon, the production of waste is not equally distributed. This global map shows you the countries who produce the most waste. Those with the darker colours, Western nations, produce the most waste, through to those lighter colour countries with the least waste. The ubiquitous, chaotic nature of rubbish means we often tend to treat rubbish as an amorphous reality. It is, however, worth breaking it down and reflecting more specifically, in particular, on 2 aspects of waste. And I want to do this now by thinking more deeply about plastic and food. The very concept of plastic, one which now surrounds our lives, is of course relatively recent. The mid-20th century saw the arrival of cheap thermal plastics, which were cheap and easily produced. In World War II, plastic became overwhelmingly used for military purposes, with plastic production leaping from 100 million kilograms at the beginning of the war in 1939 to 400 million kilograms by the end of the war. As the war ended, the question then became what to do with this massive production. And so one saw the emergence of consumer markets as one worked out what to do with this massive production of plastic. Indeed, as early as 1943, DuPont laboratories were working on homeware which was utilising plastic, working out how they could turn these into marketable products for the end of the war. That we live in a society where waste has become something that we take for granted means that we treat it as something of an amorphous reality. It surrounds our day-to-day living, rubbish on the streets, in our gardens, beside the motorways. It's worth, though, breaking down and thinking more specifically about aspects of this waste and how it helps us understand how rubbish comes about. And in the rest of this presentation, I want to draw our attention particularly on plastic and on food. Firstly, plastic. The fact that we live in a society now saturated by plastic is a recent invention. Plastic really only emerges in the 20th century. In fact, it's during the Second World War when plastic begins to be used overwhelmingly for military purposes that we begin to see our modern day problem. Plastic production leaped during the Second World War, quadrupling from 100 million kilograms in the beginning of the war to 400 million kilograms of production by the end of the war. Such was this upscaling of the use of plastic for military purposes that in 1943 DuPont laboratories were already working on creating products, homeware products that would utilize plastic that they could then make available to the consumer market at the end of the Second World War. And so at the end of the Second World War, all this plastic that had been used in military purposes all of a sudden flooded into consumer markets. In our modern industrial, technological, global society, we now live surrounded and saturated by plastic. We live in a plastic world. 4% of all the fossil fuels that is extracted are made into plastic products. Another 4% of the fossil fuels that are extracted are used for this process of making the plastic products. And by 2050, it is estimated that this 8% of fossil fuel use will be 20%. 300 million tonnes of plastic is produced globally each year, and yet only 12% of this plastic is recycled. Accordingly, scientists suggest or think that up to 5 trillion pieces of microplastic exist in our ocean. One estimate suggests that one rubbish truckload is added each minute into our oceans. In our shopping, the average lifespan of an average plastic bag is 12 minutes. 8 million tonnes of plastic makes its way into our ocean each year. 10% of the seabirds, scientists tell us, have plastic in their digestive systems. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, 15 million kilograms of waste plastic used to be sent each year to China for recycling before China closed its doors in 2018. 352,000 tonnes of packaging is sent to the landfill each year in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Statistics on food waste are similarly disconcerting. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, it is estimated that the food waste discarded by New Zealanders into their curbside rubbish bins each year amounts to $872 million worth of food. The average New Zealand household discards 79 kilograms of food waste each year. Globally, the statistics are even more concerning. 1/3 of food produced for human consumption, 1.3 billion tonnes of food, is wasted every year. The irrigation used to grow this food, which is then wasted, is, it is argued, sufficient for the domestic needs of 200 litres per person per day for all 9 billion people on the planet. 10% of rich countries' global greenhouse gas emissions come from growing food that is never eaten but discarded as waste. Faced with this ever-growing waste problem, there are a number of technological solutions being offered. Increased focus around improving waste capture and recycling. In our day-to-day lives, there are increasing discussion and action around how we reduce our packaging. Keep cups, bring your own containers, plastic bags being banned. And in the area of design, people are suggesting and offering alternatives around the plastic, creations of bioplastics or seaweed packaging. In the very week I was writing this presentation, one of these technological solutions appeared in the Nature journal, an enzyme that has been discovered that breaks down plastic bottles, therefore allowing them to be recycled and reused. While all these technological solutions are valid, I want to suggest that there are some inherent flaws in this approach to thinking about the waste problem that we have. Firstly, the actual technical problem with these supposed technological solutions. Take, for example, the whole concept of recycling. There is really no such thing as recycling. Actually, it's better termed downcycling. While aluminium can be used over and over again, plastics decline over time, and after 7 to 9 times of being recycled, ultimately they're no longer able to be made into new products, and so become once again waste. Likewise, part of this technological solution fails to engage with the basic fact that recycling itself is a highly energy-intensive and polluting industrial activity, which requires energy, fossil fuels, lots of water to do, and also produces pollutants itself. So recycling doesn't solve or eliminate the problem per se, it simply mitigates it. And with the growing human population, this still doesn't solve the issue. There is still rising production of plastic, and there will need an ongoing requirement for fossil fuels to provide the base resource for the production of plastic. There is a second, more fundamental and inherent flaw, I suggest, in these technological solutions that are offered to the problem of waste. That is, the very fact that the solutions being offered are technological. I want to suggest, as I go ahead, that underlying this is this deep confidence that we have in technology to solve our problems. Such confidence makes us feel better and in control, but, I will argue, this confidence is misplaced. Stated simply, there are 3 aspects to my thesis that will follow. First, waste, I want to argue, is a phenomenon that emerges and exists within a technological modern world. Secondly, I want to argue that the inherent logic of technology, the way in which it forces us to look at the world, provides no basis for us to think differently about waste. And thirdly, our very framing and interpreting the world differently is essential if we are going to approach this problem. Purely technological solutions to the problem of waste, I argue, are deeply problematic, and that we will remain trapped in the status quo. What do I mean by this? Ultimately, what I'm arguing is that our enthrallment to technical solutions, and in fact the totalizing narrative of modern technology, the fact that we interpret and engage with the world through technological lenses, prevents us from asking much deeper questions, deeper philosophical and cultural questions, such as, what does our current problem with waste tell us about the societies we have created and inhabit? What cultural dynamics are at work that create a global society in which we poison our atmosphere, soils, waterways and oceans, and are now at the point of digesting our own waste products? What is the inner logic and narrative which shapes our throwaway society? Here, I am influenced by the thinking of 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger. In a series of lectures given just after the Second World War, Heidegger raises questions concerning technology. These were published in 1954 in German and then translated and published in English in 1977. Reflecting on the question concerning technology, Heidegger argues that generally when we think about technology, we offer an instrumental analysis. That is, that we tend to ask questions such as, what is the means of technology, and does it lead to a good end? Or does the means of technology lead to a bad end? Or we ask questions, is technology in and of itself neutral? These are questions regarding the outcome or instrumental questions. But Heidegger argues that this way of reflecting upon technology doesn't really touch on the much deeper and more important question, which is, what is the essence of technology? For Heidegger, technology is not fundamentally a machine, a tool, or a device, but rather is a way of being in the world, a way of knowing and interpreting the world. Here, Heidegger reflects on the different Greek words techne, from where we get the word technology, and episteme, where we get the word knowledge. In our contemporary world, we tend to think of these things as separate. Episteme, knowledge, is pure knowledge, and we think of the idea of theory, and then we think of the idea of bringing this theory into practice, of being experience-based. But in early Greek thinking, particularly in the writings of Plato, the relationship between theory and practice was much closer. And so there was an understanding that both knowledge and the craft of engaging with the world involved a way of knowing the world, of engaging with the world, or as Heidegger would say, a mode of being in the world. For Heidegger, technology reveals itself as a way of being in the world. For him, this is most clearly expressed through a utilitarian and fragmentary nature. Nature and other humans are no longer seen as an entity with depth in and of themselves, but rather are seen in a utilitarian function, that is, how they can be used. For example, one looks at a forest and sees standing timber. The second dynamic Heidegger points out is the fragmentary nature of technological lenses. That is, within this mode of being in the world, entities are not understood relationally, but rather as dislocated and alienated parts. Within this way of encountering the world, entities become objects to be ordered, assembled, disassembled, and ultimately discarded. Heidegger, reflecting on this technological mode of being in the world, writes, "The revealing that rules throughout modern technology has the character of a setting upon, in the sense of a challenging forth. That challenging happens in that the energy concealed in nature is unlocked. What is unlocked is transformed. What is transformed is stored up. What is stored up is in turn distributed, and what is distributed is switched about ever anew. Unlocking, transforming, storing, distributing, and switching about are ways of revealing, but the revealing never simply comes to an end." Heidegger's argument is that technology both reveals and simultaneously conceals the truth about the world we inhabit. This revealing and concealing force of human technology is illustrated in the TED-Ed video that I will show next. When the next slide appears, I would like you to pause this video and click on the YouTube link and watch the 4-minute video entitled "What Really Happens to the Plastic You Throw Away." While the video at one level simply describes the industrial process involved in the technology of recycling, I particularly want to draw your attention to the philosophical and metaphysical language employed in describing this technological process. The way in which religious and theological vocabulary is used to describe the technology of recycling in attempting to explain its way of being in the world and the truth of the world itself. I find it fascinating here that a video simply describing the industrial process of recycling plastic bottles so clearly illustrates Heidegger's understanding that technology both reveals and conceals the world as it really is. The striking philosophical, religious, and theological language through the video is hard to miss. We see at the beginning bottles that are empty and discarded. Here, echoes of Genesis 1:2, of the world being formless and void. We are told that at issue here is nothing less than the state of the planet. The connections here between the mythological creation story and the narrator's attempt to describe of his attempts to first explore the origins of these plastic bottles. He draws upon Greek Homeric themes, suggesting that the heroes of our stories were conceived in an oil refinery, And then he continues with this language of ancient creation epics, suggesting that these bottles were formed by chemically bonded into long polymer chains, melted at manufacturing plants, reformed in molds that make up the triplet's body. Noting here the language of embodiment which is given to this impersonal and industrial process. Machines fill the bottle with sweet, bubbly liquid, like godlike machines filling the bottles with the breath of life. The actual process of their lives, which is the reason for their existence, are now narrated promptly by the narrator. They are wrapped, shipped, bought, opened, consumed, and unceremoniously discarded. A sense here in which we are concealed from the truth of the reality of these objects. It is this description which is pregnant with meaning, which is begging for interrogation, which the narrative actually overlooks. Technology both reveals and conceals. And yet then we reach the tour de force of the video. We are told that these plastic bottles are now poised at the edge of the unknown. Almost metaphysical language there. And then there is a recounting of the various trajectories of these bottles that cross this edge. Like hundreds of millions of others, these plastic brethren, again, language of relationality. We are told that these bottles take an agonizing 1,000 years to decompose. Again, language of embodiment. Bottle 2's journey, an inanimate object, we are told, is stranger, but unfortunately no happier. Bottle 3, we are told, is spared the cruel purgatories of his brothers. Deeply theological language. And then ultimately we reach the sense of salvation. Salvation arrives in the form of more technology. A truck which brings a truck which brings bottle 3 to the plant, where it is squeezed flat and compressed into a block. We are told that as if by magic, bottle 3 is now ready to be reborn as something completely new. Echoes here of St. Paul. Indeed, we are told for this little piece of plastic with humble origins, suddenly the sky is the limit. And so encapsulated here in the video is something of Heidegger's puzzle around technology. The promise of rising above one's origins, but ultimately we are trapped within this cycle. The sky is the limit, and yet ultimately it's not the limit. It's captured within this endless industrial process. Technology both reveals but also conceals a world as it really is to us. Following Heidegger's analysis of technology and drawing now on the work of Canadian philosopher Greg Kennedy, I want to suggest that we live in a culture where we most see technology revealing itself through the contemporary process of commodification. That is, that we live in a time of culture where the essence of technology's revealing is in this process of commodification. Perhaps the best example of this is the way in which we see food being commodified within our contemporary global world. As we did with plastic, it's worth reflecting briefly here on the history of food and the way in which that intersects with the mode of being of technology. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, farming in Western countries was largely small-scale and local. Yet over the last 2 centuries, farming methods have radically changed due to technological innovations. Hydraulic technology, that is the building of dams and canals, allows easy access to water. Mechanisation has meant that machinery has replaced labourers. And fossil fuels both fuel those machines but also give access to faraway markets. Perhaps the best example of this interface of technology and how that has reshaped our understanding of food is with regard to nitrate. Nitrate is essential as the plant available form of nitrogen, and yet most of agriculture's 10,000-year history has been a challenge on how to get nitrogen back into the soil. This changed in the early 20th century due to the work of German chemist Fritz Hamer, who was able to create a high-temperature, energy-intensive process to fix nitrogen in the air and to then synthesize it. Nitrate, of course, is also an essential ingredient in modern-day weaponry, and so, as with plastic, At the end of World War II, the USA had constructed 10 large-scale nitrate factories to use in the munition industry. Suddenly, with the war ending, the question was what to do with all that nitrate. Now this massive production of nitrates was redirected into agriculture. And so post-World War II, there was a green revolution, the development of high-yield, disease-resistant varieties of cereals, and the emergence of petrochemical fertilizers. These brought about profound changes in the patterns of farming, but human societies were also radically changed through this process. An instrumental analysis of this form of technology again would speak about the ends which have come from this use of technology within the food industry. Again, though, this obscures us from perhaps the deeper questions around the way in which this form of technology is a mode of being in the world. Drawing here on Heidegger, it's interesting to note the utilitarian and fragmentary nature of these technologies. Rivers, waterways, and land now become useful and valuable for their agricultural production. Other values, aesthetic or cultural, are overridden by economic questions. There is a fragmentation and a disconnection from the broader relationships. The relationship between waterway and land, between the species living in these waterways, and between human relationships and these waterways and these species is destroyed. The relationship within human communities, that is, the decline of rural populations and a reordering of relationships with these communities, also takes place. Finally, this form of industrial technology has also fragmented our conceptions of time. British theologian Michael Northcott, in particular, speaks about the way in which fossil fuels and the use of those in our food industry has reshaped our culture towards one of immediacy. And indeed, this is an element of what we see today in our understanding of food as a commodity. Industrially produced food is an expression of contemporary technology's way of being in the world. Food as a commodity is instantaneous. We expect it on demand, and it's available on demand. It's ubiquitous. It removes questions of spatial constriction. It's always safe, removing our vulnerability, and accessing it is one of ease. All this means that we become people with a way of being in the world where we expect the instant, we expect things to be on hand, we expect it to be safe, and we expect our life to be ease. But, as Greg Kennedy notes, this way of being comes at a cost. The very telos, the very end result of a commodity, is it renders us as the consumer carefree. Greg Kennedy notes the way in which our two concerns here, food and plastic, reach a nexus here in the form of technological commodification. Food, a deeply, deeply sacred embodied object, and plastic, a way of being in the world, a form of technology, intersect here in our modern food industry. He writes, "In the age of commodification, plastic becomes nearly inseparable from food. To seal a piece of food in plastic means to sever all remaining relations it has with living nature. The modern marriage between plastic and food extends far beyond utilitarian concerns of storage and preservation. Plastic is a substance completely inert and lifeless. Technology favours it for its outstanding malleability. Plastic, unlike natural materials such as wood and stone, offers no substantial resistance to its manipulation. The natural aspects of food remain recalcitrant to the technological will to mastery, but when enclosed in lifeless matter, these aspects lose the vitality of resistance. Technology masters substance in the form of plastic, and then uses the latter to master food, the very substrate of substance. Hermetically sealed off from its natural cycle of growth and decay, packaged food, despite its toxic encasement, appears safely disconnected from finitude." And so there's a sense in which this ongoing sense in which technology both reveals and obscures itself from us, is revealed in the modern world of waste, food waste, and plastic waste. And so the commodity of food in our contemporary world becomes a supreme example, arguably, of this mode of being that technology offers and the logic of modern day capitalism. Entities are no longer understood according to their relationship with other realities, but rather are purely dislocated resources to be seen as commodities. These entities can be used to create commodities that can then be bought and sold according to the utilitarian logic and financial valuation which lies within modern day capitalism. All of nature can become commodified and turned into products. And once these entities have finished their usefulness and are no longer exchangeable, they can be discarded. Within the conceptual framework of technological commodifying capitalism, discarded items no longer have utility and are therefore of no value. They become discarded, but they become therefore what? Essentially, they become non-entities. They no longer exist within that way of being in the world. They are no longer in our mind, and therefore we literally can no longer see them. They have ceased to exist as such. And it is this analysis which perhaps explains why, for so long in our contemporary societies, waste has literally been out of sight, out of mind. We know that actually plastic has been in our oceans for a long time, and yet perhaps we have not been able to see them because such is our way of being captured by a technological way of being in the world, that we have been unable to see those realities. It is only now, as this way of being in the world begins to be questioned, that we've actually begun to see the waste that we have created as a society. And so we live with something of a conundrum in our modern technological world of commodification. On the one hand, objects that are discarded are regarded as having no entity, they have no essence or no being, and yet we need to give them a nominative title, we need to give them a name which puts them somewhere into our system of understanding, and so we come up with words such as waste or rubbish. And yet, on the other hand, there is also an impulse to bring this waste back into the overarching schema, to incorporate them back into the world and our understanding. In many ways, I would argue, recycling is the second of these impulses. That which is regarded as a non-entity, or to think of the earlier video that we saw, as discarded, is now reborn as a resource and reintegrated into the technology of commodification, available once again for circulation in the global economy, and therefore recognised with value once again. And so the technology of recycling itself becomes, like all technology, a certain way of being in the world. It reveals the world to us, but also conceals the world from us in depth. Ultimately, we end up with a paradox where we want to keep our streets clean in our cities, and yet we don't want to shut down our landfills. The technological solution of recycling deals with the minor issue, integrating back into our way of understanding this non-entity called waste, and yet not dealing with the deeper existential crisis that we face, which is the production of these non-entities of waste. As Greg Kennedy suggests, industrialized recycling, for all its environmental benefits, serves also as a convenient distraction, a kind of white noise to muffle out the vocational call of ontological care. We've created a society in which we live at ease and carefree, but as Kennedy notes, carefreeness is the real promise of technology, but its true fulfillment is ultimately trash.